So like I said before the break, they're just a bunch of slides that I put together with a few people, just sort of chucking ideas around. They're not meant to 100% guide the conversation, but they're sort of things that we've heard either members around this table talk about, or have heard in the wider world, or just concerns we've had, or issues that we thought are just worth exploring. So with that all said, I'll just start with these first two slides, which are sort of my sort of thinking around the issues, not the issues, the risks of the reform, what you're faced with if you're not going to be part of the amalgamation, and also potentially what some opt-in opportunities are before we start talking about the issues, the flip side, the negative aspects or potential negative aspects of being part of the reform. So I think Kevin largely covered these issues through his discussion, but council, if we remain out of the reform, we've got that big issue there around council responsibility for non-council suppliers being the supplier of last resort. There's also elements around keeping pace with the new regulatory environment. We've sort of talked quite a bit today around Te Mata Arawai and their approach that they'll be taking around drinking water standards regulation, and particularly enforcement. The economic regulator, the last part of Kevin's discussion there, is what's this economic regulator going to do? And while we didn't really nail exactly what they do, I think we all heard Kevin saying that they'll have powers and they'll probably want to use them. So there'll be performance comparisons between MPDC and whatever other entities or other councils there would be. So there will be a constant, compared to today, a constant comparison of how we're performing versus others, which may or may not be comfortable to live with. They'll be across things such as, customer perception of our services, and they'll be across industry as well, and what industry appeal we have. And like I've already said in the previous slides, we're going to face these risks around level of service increases and financial risk driven by the regulatory, particularly environmental framework. Some opportunities and opt-in for those who want to sort of think about that side of things is, would we be getting a higher level of service? Maybe. It might be a bit more nuanced than that. It might be a higher level of macro level of service. There could be promises and potentially delivery on those promises against consents and drinking water standards earlier, faster than we think we can do it, maybe. But that could come at a trade-off of local micro level of service around how quickly someone can come out and repair your leaking Toby box, for example. Lower cost to the consumer, to the customer. We've seen the government's modelling around that. So again, on the assumption that all this is true, which I know we've got reservations about, that's potentially a opportunity, right? Is to deliver the service at a lower cost, potentially. Also, there's the other one here, which sort of touched around a little bit, and it speaks to the concerns around delivery of our LTP or anything beyond that, which is maybe these entities would have the ability to reshape supply chains in a way that we can't as MPDC. And the best example I could think of that would be, again, looking at Watercare. So going with the Neil approach, let's have a look at Watercare. Watercare, of course, brought that massive tunnel drilling device across from Germany, I think it was, to drill their central interceptor. What other industry, maybe even in New Zealand, has the power to reach out there and get that sort of technology in New Zealand? I'm not saying that MPDC needs a $4 billion tunnel, but it's a practical example of a much larger entity having some sort of market leverage to get technology and solutions into the country that we may not necessarily have available for ourselves today. For those, I think you guys might have the links in some previous emails, but the other part of the Becca video that we saw was actually Lorraine Kendrick talking, and she's worked over in the UK under their system, and she actually made some direct comparisons between the available technology in the UK versus here in New Zealand. So, that's potentially an opportunity. Whether you think all those opportunities or potential opportunities outweigh the risks of being involved, well, that's really the nub of the question. So with that, let's have a quick look through some of the issues as I sort of saw them. The first one was the one that we've had knocking around. I think Bruce brought this one up more directly, which was the power of veto. So what I managed to find on this so far is that at least government's saying they're making their structures in such a way that there is no power of veto. That's what they're at least saying. Particularly, they've singled out mana whenua and said no single mana whenua representative could have a power of veto or exert negative control. They've said that in their cabinet papers. Again, I'm not going to put any weighting on whether you take that to the bank or not, but just trying to raise the awareness to you guys about what has been said or published at least. And you may think, well, that's a significant issue that we want to investigate further and somewhere we want to target. Another one was around ownership and privatization. So this one here was interesting. I think it was James Sainsbury a few weeks back sort of said, hey, well, what's the difference between tomorrow and today? The government, in theory, could pass some laws today and take all the assets off us. And that's true. They can. And potentially this is both an issue and an opportunity, depending on how we play it out, to get more security around ownership of our own assets. Though a second interesting element to this discussion would be council still remains the owner. At least that's what's said in all the documentation. I know we can talk until the cows come home about what that exactly means and what the functionality between ownership and shareholding is. But I think an interesting area to target, which was in some of the paperwork or some of the documentation around the case for change, was that while there'll be no financial recognition and no direct governance oversight because of the structure, there is still the Standard & Poor's modelling around this and the value of the privatisation in terms of all the credit scoring and all the rest of it. It's still said in there that there was a medium to high level of expectation that the councils in those entities would take on some sort of responsibility should those entities get into trouble. I'm not sure what that really means, and that's probably maybe something we could be teasing out as well. I know when I talked to Don about this, he said, well, the entities will be big and they won't get into trouble because they'll just leverage more water rates. And maybe that's true, and maybe it's a red herring, but at least it's there in the paperwork that sort of the driver to have a separation from council's balance sheet, and to do that, you need to have a separation of governance. But yet, at the end of the day, there is still a level of expectation, at least from Standard & Poor's, when they do their evaluation, that there is still some responsibility link back to council. The main difference was, and you'll see that in some later slides, the main difference seemed to be the order in which you shuffled the cards under the current proposal from government. Government would be the first port of call should the entities get in trouble, and then councils appeared to be the second port of call under that. Another issue we've been talking about and more recently is cross-subsidisation. And I put this image on here about Waikato-Lass, and Kevin raised it as well. We already do a level of cross-subsidisation. Earlier in our conversation today, I think we all sort of broadly agreed that a level of aggregation / cross-subsidisation is probably sensible. I guess the real question is what is the right size of the cross-subsidisation and therefore the right regional boundaries? I know Neil's being very clear today and saying, hey, he thinks it's something Waikato regional, not Waikato Taranaki super regional, or Bay of Plenty super regional. So, I'll be interested to hear your guys' discussion on that, and we think collectively we need to take that discussion and what we need to be looking at. Again, linking back to the privatisation and ownership discussion there, the new entities are going to have balance sheet separation, but there's still a high, but there's going to be a low degree of governor influence. So while the entities won't be directly accountable to you as our elected officials, do they have enough accountability to the customer because there is a consumer body? That's something you need to weigh up as well. Do the councillors necessarily, or elected officials necessarily, have to be the ones taking the customer voice directly to the entity? Or maybe on balance, do we consider the customer body Maybe it needs some more bells and whistles, but the customer body is capable of doing that on our behalf. Who knows? Beyond that, there's going to be a need to select a regional representative group. So what views do we have about how that regional representation group is going to be selected? How do we make sure that in that selection process that Matamata-Piako residents are represented? Just for those who are interested, there was actually another scenario modeled that was known as scenario 3 amongst all that sort of Standard & Poor's type of work on the DIA website. And that was one where we had a high degree of governor influence. As far as I can tell, which I'm not an expert in this, guys, so please take this with a grain of salt. Like I said before, the difference, having a high level of governor involvement, seemed to have elevated the level of financial responsibility that the councils will have to the entity. And I guess that sort of makes inherent sense to me in terms of balance sheet separation or lack thereof. There's a lot of mechanisms for influence here. Is how many of them do council directly control or not is potentially a big question there. We get to select half of a regional representation group, or at least participate in the selection of half. The regional representation group themselves are the ones who issue the strategic and performance expectations, not directly coming from the councils of mana whenua. So that's an interesting nuance there. How do you select these people then, at least for us, guarantee or ensure that our thoughts or the flavor of our growth strategic and performance expectations makes it through to those statements as a question mark. At what point do the regulators' expectations get fully baked into this model? Are they more important than the strategic and performance expectations devised by the regional representation group? What level does Te Mana o Te Wai statements have of importance in here? If you have a conflict between a strategic statement and a Te Mana o Te Wai statement, who wins? How do you at least resolve what should be actioned and in what order? These are all sorts of things with these new influence structures that I think we need to understand. In my opinion, is we need to understand. There'll still be public consultation, so that's something that's not too dissimilar to what we're seeing here with our LTP. There'll still be a requirement for those entities to go out and seek public's input on that. As I said last time we met, there's going to be a GPS, a government policy statement. Again, probably the same questions around Te Mana o Te Wai, the regulator, and the strategic and performance expectation documents. Where does that statement sit in terms of importance? How will that craft, or maybe even better, how will that ring fence the ability of the particularly the regional representation group into setting the direction for this entity? The government has said, though, that the entity itself will be a plan follower, not a plan setter. So have we seen enough from the government? Have we seen enough in the plans and in the detail to be assured that is actually what's going to happen, that once these plans are established, they're going to be followed and there'll be no ability for the entities to not deliver on those? That's a big question mark. I've also got in their spatial plans from the RMA. The government in their GPS sort of discussion talks directly about delivery of spatial plans, and obviously that's part of the RMA reform. So a slightly broader question here would be, if MPDC around this table are looking to make sure we continue to have influence on these entities, is targeting the water reform itself the right way to do it? Question mark. Maybe some of our attention should be spent more over the RMA if they're going to have to follow the spatial plans. So there might need to be a balancing act there about exactly what we ask for today in a water reform versus what we ask for tomorrow in an RMA reform, or possibly some interconnection about making sure that what happens with this water reform is directly tied to an outcome we're seeking in the RMA reform. Question marks. I guess that's what these all are just question marks of things I think we should consider. Yeah. So the following one here, it's just an illustrative slide around the Standard & Poor's work. This is lifted directly from those. For those who understand it, and I don't think I entirely do, it's, at least to me, demonstrated that all of 6 scenarios measured by Standard & Poor's, that it wasn't, though if any of you know more about ratings than I do, and I'm sure you do, there didn't seem to be a significant ratings difference between a lot of them. As you can sort of see in that yellow box there, that's the only real significant change. Some are A+, and some are negative, A+, minus, and stable, whatever that means. So exactly how much weight does the current proposed governance model have on this, and how significant is it, is probably a question. Cool. As we've already touched on here, levels of service. You know, what's our balance as a council? Where do we see the balance being between macro and micro level of service? You know, I've heard a lot today, well, not a lot, I've heard a bit today around micro level of service. We've often talked and framed things in terms of how responsive is the entity going to be to a customer complaint. Obviously, we're very responsive to that right now, and we have even, I'd say, a sliding level of service depending on what season it is, depending on what service it is. We publish and state our leak repair benchmarks, but we often exceed those or functionally half those response times during summer. You may not get that with an entity. We may not care because we may get a greater standard of water treatment and compliance with that standard or any future standards. How much does that matter to us versus those macro level of service considerations? Financially, this is a bit of an older slide, so it's got the governmental stuff in there as opposed to Lania's stuff. But do we have greater access to funding without the 3 waters on our balance sheet? I think Lania's stated that yep, on the surface of it we do. We have a higher debt cap there. How beneficial is that to us versus potentially relinquishing some control of our water assets? How significant is our no financial recognition of ownership or shareholding? I know one way of viewing the financial recognition is if you were to have the councils sell the assets to the new entities, could that actually result in the water ratepayers paying for assets twice? They've already paid for them with us, and now they're paying off that debt a second time. That's one way of viewing it, and I'm sure we all have different ways of viewing it, but how significant is that non-financial recognition to us as we make our decisions? Again, related, but in a different sphere, is there a fair acknowledgement of council's historic investment and performance of our asset classes versus other TLAs in the Entity 2 group? And how does that play into sweeteners, for lack of a better word? So these new entities, again, will be reaching out to offshore markets. So how do we protect against potential negative impacts of that behaviour? I might just leave it at that. I think you guys can all think of scenarios, maybe not in New Zealand, but in the Pacific, where offshore capital markets have had significant impacts on local decision making and local control. So what protections do we have in place for that? Economics and growth and development. So, you know, MPDC, and we sort of talked about this already today, MPDC has worked really hard to be a place of choice for large-scale dairy and meat industry operators. We don't want that to change. What can we seek from a reform, whether it's being aggregated or otherwise, which protect our market position in that way? They're a significant part of our communities, not just because they're employers, but we are a rural farming-based area. This is our bread and butter, and this is part of our identity. We don't want to lose that. How do we maintain that competitive industrial edge, or at least have it sharpened maybe through a reform of any sort? Also, how do we guarantee or better ensure that our residential growth aspirations are delivered on as we move forward? And I appreciate some of this ties in with the influence aspects of it as well. Again, one I'm probably not very well placed to talk about, you know, but what's the future of us, local government, if we were to continue with this reform? You know, you've got this reform, RMA is going to change us. We're going to have the local government review is going to change us as well. What support do we need in order to make these multiple changes? Maybe the water reform is not the best place to get all that support, but maybe it's a vehicle to help us raise those concerns. And I hear that happening all over the show, that we are, as a sector, raising the concerns around the pace of change and our ability to respond to so many very large scale, at least for us, large scale reforms. Issues about consultation. So I saw that in the chat line as well, that these reforms trigger our significance policy. Right now, we've received advice from legal advice saying that today, during this 8-week period, there's no need to consult or anything like that. All we're doing is talking, we're not making decisions. But are we expected to consult at the end of this 8-week period? And how do we fit that consultation in under the current mechanisms we have available to us? So, that's, I think, a valid question. I think I've heard you raise that, Ash, a couple of times about, fine, once you get the 8-week period out of the way, how much runway is there left for us to actually have a genuine engagement with our community through a consultative process? So I guess, like last time we talked about this, in my mind, we have to put all these issues in a melting pot. And I'm sure you guys will go away and think about things for a bit longer and be able to feed back. But really what, in my opinion, we need to drive to is what a value proposition for MPDC is. What can we get out of this reform? What are we willing to trade away? And how do we explore that value proposition to make sure that we get what's best for our community? And I'm not saying that means we need to roll with the reform. I'm not saying that we need to oppose the reform, but I think there's something in the middle there that we need to be advocating for eventually once we understand all the implications to us, and we understand our own thoughts and the solutions that we may want to pose, or the rectifications we want to propose to central government. The final one here is a very selfish one for me, which is an ongoing works program. So I appreciate we're going to have a few more workshops about this. This is going to be quite a detailed discussion for a few weeks now. So have a think about what things you would like staff to go away and investigate and develop. We've provided some information here today already, but I'm sure there's more key bits of information. I mean, Neil raised off the bat the performance of Scottish Water in the BBC article there. How much of that stuff do you think is relevant? How much of that stuff do you want to see? I'm sure there's other New Zealand-based or local-based questions that you have that you'd like more information on. Get those in for us, and we can develop a work plan and develop some future discussion points to answer those questions. The point at the end of the day for me as staff is not driving you to a decision, but enabling you guys to have an informed decision at the end of the day, regardless of whatever that choice is. I would like you guys to be able to put hand on heart and say, hey, we understood all the issues here. Our team supported us. We got the information we needed in a timely way to make a good decision, and we can stand by it with our facts. So that's what this slide is all about, is have a think, feed that back through Don, and help us develop an ongoing work program for the next 8 weeks to answer key questions and get key information in your hands, so we can make an informed decision when we need to make it. Be that a decision in terms of what details we like to feed back to government, or future down the track in terms of an opt-in, opt-out decision.